All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Before we get started, let me remind you to silence any chirping, ringing devices that you may have. I'm Glenn Moots, professor here at Northwood University and director of Northwood University's Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise. And I'm very happy to see all of you here this afternoon, especially since we're competing with a beautiful day. So being here on a nice day in October is above and beyond the call of duty. The theme of our semester programming is Capitalism Moral? And there goes something. Please silence all your stuff. So last month we did a program on capitalism and enterprise, and we take the historical route again this month, looking into the work of one of the first great modern economists, Adam Smith. So we advertised this program as What Adam Smith Thought About Capitalism. It might surprise you, and yes, that title is a bit of an anachronism. There was no such thing as capitalism when Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations, I see his other great work staring at me, making me feel bad for calling The Wealth of Nations his great work, but I'm sure you'll learn more about that in a minute. When his great work, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. And though it's arguably true that the elements of capitalism were being advanced by rising ideas of political economy, the term itself came along at least 10 years after Smith's publication. Furthermore, Smith has been criticized or praised as being for some elements of what is now called capitalism, or at least laissez-faire capitalism. In short, Smith is not as simple as some would have you think, and before the hyper-specialization of the university, much of its great work was done by philosophers like Smith, who explored the breadth and depth of nature, including human nature and human society, and integrating questions like that with scientific questions is always complicated. And as my students know, the best philosophical answer to any question is always, it depends. So here, to help us sort out what Adam Smith thought and said, are two great scholars who have published on Smith's work and origins of modern commercial society. Chris Martin is assistant professor of economics at Hillsdale College down the road. He has taught previously at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma and was a John Marshall visiting research fellow at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. Chris was a 2012 graduate of George Mason University's doctoral economics program, and before his academic career served as an educational programs manager at the Institute for Humane Studies. Paul Mueller, who is on the far left here. Are you on the far left, Paul?
Facing them.
my left, and Chris is there on the right, and Dale Magic in the middle. Paul is an assistant professor of economics at King's College, the King's College in Manhattan. Before joining King's, he completed his PhD also at George Mason University and received bachelor's degrees in economics and political science from Hillsdale College. His academic interests include monetary economics, financial markets, public choice economics, the history of economic theory, and Austrian economics. He's been published in academic journals such as the Adam Smith Review, the Journal of Private Enterprise, the Review of Austrian Economics, as well as in popular outlets like USA Today, Fox News, and The Hill. So we're going to run this essentially as a panel, and Professor Dale Magic, a man who needs no introduction, is going to head up the panel. And he'll have some questions for our speakers after their respective presentations, and the floor is also yours for questions after their presentations. They'll both speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll move to discussion amongst the panelists and with all of you as the audience. And we'll just take questions from the floor. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you of our upcoming programs on October 24th. That's just a little while here. October 24th, Monday at 7 o'clock, Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute will be here speaking on the sharing economy and the future of work. So if you're curious to know whether you're all going to work for Uber someday, come here, Jared Meyer, and he'll talk about that. Also, November 1st, which is a Tuesday, Jim Johnson. Some of you may have had Jim as a professor. He's out at Ithaca College now, but he'll be debating Vinnie Vernuccio from the Mackinac Center on right to work. That's on November 1st, essentially right to work in unions. And then on November 15th, our big event in here, also 7 o'clock, a debate on the question, is capitalism moral, at 7 o'clock, November 15th. And for all our semester programs, we owe a tremendous thanks to the Institute for Humane Studies and the John Templeton Foundation. They have been our partners throughout the semester and are supporting tonight's event as well. IHS is located in Arlington, Virginia, and advances a freer society by facilitating the development of students and scholars who share an interest in liberty. And when you came in, you got an IHS survey. If you could please fill that out. There will be 2 baskets in the back table and a box on the chairs just outside. If you could put those completed surveys in those places, we'll get them off to IHS. We want to know what you thought, what you liked about this panel, and IHS would like to get to know you. So their sponsorship is enabled by the John Templeton Foundation, which serves as a philanthropic catalyst for discoveries related to the big questions of human purpose and ultimate reality. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Matchuk, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Moots. Welcome, everybody. It is good to see you here for a presentation about one of the most influential economists of all time, somebody who is widely cited, but probably not as widely read and probably not as widely understood. So I will say that he has undergone a bit of a revival of late. There are popular books being written about Adam Smith. There's a book about how reading Adam Smith can change your life by Russ Roberts. Nobel Prize-winning economist A.K. Sen recently wrote about Adam Smith, a reassessment, and Bill Gates recommended that everybody should read Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he certainly, although he's long gone, he's certainly current. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Paul, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about Adam Smith.
First, let me thank Glenn for inviting me and Dale for facilitating this panel. Thank you all for coming. I think that you're in for a treat here. Chris is very good, and you're about to hear a lot about Adam Smith, who's one of the best thinkers in the Western tradition. And so I'm going to highlight a few of the highlights from my research and how Smith thinks about markets and about happiness, how he thinks about the interplay between freedom and virtue. But first, let me set the stage just a little bit by giving you a brief bio of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith is a Scotsman. He was born in Scotland in 1723 and died in 1790 in Edinburgh. And he lived in Scotland in a really interesting period of time. So if you were to go to Scotland in the late 1500s, the early 1600s, it was very poor. Very, very poor. It was all farmers, very agrarian, very poor. It was kind of the backwaters of Europe. And yet by the time Smith is born, and particularly by the time he is writing and teaching at the University of Glasgow, Glasgow and Edinburgh and Scotland more generally have become one of the highest places of learning in Europe. And so there's been this tremendous revival, this tremendous transition going on. There's been a rise in literacy. There's been an explosion in commerce and development. And this is what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. And Adam Smith was a part of that. There were other great thinkers that you may have heard of who were part of that. James Watt, who invented the steam engine, Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, Lord Kames, Thomas Reid, and the list goes on and on. You have poets, you have philosophers, you have architects, you have engineers, you have Thomas Black in chemistry. So you're having advances in all these different fields, and all of these guys knew each other, and they were all in Scotland, which is a small place on the whole. They were all in Scotland, they all knew each other. So you have the Scottish Enlightenment going on, and Adam Smith is right in the center of it and is an example of it. He wrote about many things, not just economics. He actually held a chair of moral philosophy. That's what he taught. But he wrote about jurisprudence, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about the arts and letters. And to give you a sense of it, he's most well known for his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. All right? Wealth of Nations for short. You can just remember that. All right, so it's this large book that he published in 1776, a relatively famous year. And this book has been sort of foundational in the development of economics. It was the first major treatise that covered a lot of how markets work, how people decide what to do, how prices adjust. But it wasn't his first work. He actually wrote a book before that Professor Moots was referring to earlier called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. All right, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And remember, his position is Chair of Moral Philosophy at Glasgow University. He's a moral philosopher who happens to be really interested in markets and how markets promote morality and how they interact with people's morals. So he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments 17 years earlier, 1759. And what's interesting about The Theory of Moral Sentiments is that he continued to revise that book over and over and over again. The last edition of The Theory of Moral Sentiments came out in 1790, the year he died. It was the 6th edition. And there were substantial revisions that went on in that last year. So this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I'll hold it up here if you can see it. The Theory of Moral Sentiments was the book he interacted with his entire life. He was always thinking about it. He was updating it. He was making changes. And what I'm going to present to you is a reason why, if you really want to understand Smith and you want to understand the morality behind markets, you actually have to read not just The Wealth of Nations, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments, because the two books go together and they inform one another. All right, you might ask, which book was more important? Well, from a historical perspective, The Wealth of Nations was more important. It's more well-known, it's been more influential, it's been cited more frequently. There's no doubt about that. For Smith, I think Theory of Moral Sentiments was a more important book, and he refers in some of his correspondence to saying that was the better book that he wrote. And then, as I just said, for us, we should really read them together to think about what it is that he does. So let me set up a puzzle for you. All right, here's the puzzle of how Smith thinks about economics and what we're trying to do in the economy. So I assume most of you have taken economics courses, but for those of you who don't, here's a very quick crash course. First, utility, the usefulness, the enjoyment we get out of things is subjective. All right? You value or enjoy chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream differently than I do. You enjoy long walks in the park less or more, video games, everything that we engage with and interact with. We value, we enjoy, we get utility out of, but it's subjective. We get different utility depending on who we are, our tastes, and our preferences. So that's first, subjective utility. All right? Then what economists think about is, well, how do people maximize their utility, right? How do they pursue getting more utility in terms of thinking about, they try to pursue activities or goods that they value more as opposed to those that they value less. And then what kind of constraints do they face? We have subjective utility, people try to maximize their utility, and that's subject to constraints, right? We'd all love to go cruise around the world or go travel Europe, but we don't have the money or the time to do it. We have constraints that we face in the things that we're trying to do. But the goal of economics, at least narrowly construed, is always, okay, how do we get people more money, more wealth to relieve the budget constraints so that they can maximize their utility, can get more utility? All right, that's sort of the traditional economics framework, and Smith is partially on board with that. One thing he says in The Wealth of Nations is he says that consumption is the sole end of production. The only reason we produce things is to enjoy them, to consume them. So that seems very utility maximizing sort of thinking. But if you read The Wealth of Nations closely, there are several parts where Smith says that some forms of consumption are extravagant or wasteful or frivolous. All right, he actually condemns various forms of consumption, which seems odd if our goal is to, the only reason we produce stuff is to consume it and we're trying to maximize utility. If that's the goal and it's subjective, how can he go around saying, you know what, that use of gold in dishes or that use of fine lace or whatever it is frivolous, is wasteful, etc. How can he condemn that if utility is subjective to the person and we're trying to increase our utility? So this was a question I asked in grad school, and this was one of the first puzzles I was working on with Smith, which is how does Smith decide? What standard is he using to say that some types of consumption are good, but other types are extravagant or wasteful or frivolous? All right, and the further question is not just how did Smith decide that, but is his distinction, when we look at that, is it relevant for us today? Is it something that applies to us as we think about our own pursuit of utility or of happiness? All right, so to answer that question, we have to think about what is happiness. And Smith thought about this. He wrote about this in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. All right, he says, I'm going to read a little bit of Smith here at different points because he's a beautiful writer, and it's worth reading and sort of thinking about what he's talking about. So here's how he talks about happiness. He says the following: happiness consists in tranquility and enjoyment. Without tranquility or peacefulness, there can be no enjoyment. And where there is perfect tranquility, there is scarce anything which is not capable of amusing. And then he says, the great source of both the misery and disorders of human life seems to arise from overrating the difference between one permanent situation and another. Avarice overrates the difference between poverty and riches. Ambition overrates the difference between a private and a public station. Vainglory overrates the difference between obscurity and extensive reputation. And then he says the following. This is important. I don't know if any of you are aware or care about the fact that income and wealth in the U.S. are not equally held by everyone. That's something people seem to talk about today. So you might care about that. But think about this. This is a claim that Smith makes. He says, in all the ordinary situations of human life, rich or poor, a well-disposed mind may be equally calm, equally cheerful, and equally contented. Some of those situations about being well-known, having a public station, having wealth, may no doubt deserve to be preferred to others, but none of them can deserve to be pursued with that passionate ardor which drives us to violate the rules either of prudence or of justice, or to corrupt the future tranquility of our own minds. And then I'll read one more quote for you here and then continue talking about it. He says, in the most glittering and exalted situation that our idle fancy can hold out to us, the pleasures from which we propose to derive our real happiness are almost always the same with those which in our actual, though humble station, we have at all times at hand and in our power. Except for the frivolous pleasures of vanity and superiority, we may find in the most humble station, where there is only personal liberty, and every other which the most exalted can afford, and the pleasures of vanity and superiority are seldom consistent with perfect tranquility, the principle and foundation of all real and satisfactory enjoyment. All right? So Smith here, when he talks about happiness, he says happiness is not primarily about utility maximization in a narrow sense. He says that our ability to enjoy things actually depends on our state of mind, on our tranquility, on the peacefulness that we have. And that is not something that comes with wealth necessarily, and it's not something that you can't have with less wealth. So you've already got a little bit here of thinking about happiness. All right, this view that we need this inner tranquility. So he talks about inner tranquility, he talks about enjoyment. And so the way I think about this is happiness is consumption or enjoyment, right? Actually enjoying pizza, enjoying being able to do things, all the sorts of things that we consume, but it also requires virtue. All right, so happiness is consumption plus virtue. And now if you go back, and we're not going to do this here, if you want to, you can see my paper on this, but if you go back and you look at the places where Smith condemns consumption as extravagant, as wasteful, as frivolous, what you find is that all of those situations involve consumption that cuts against virtue, all right, that he thinks will make people less tranquil, less able to enjoy the things of this life. That some forms of consumption actually cut against our tranquility, and that is really destructive of our happiness. So that has all kinds of implications that maybe we can unpack during the Q&A session about that. Here's one application that Smith makes, again, to the pursuit of wealth and to thinking about wealth. Smith is sometimes painted, or caricatured rather, as this blind advocate of capitalism, of accumulating as much wealth as possible. Here's my favorite story in Smith, and I'm going to read excerpts from it. It's just, again, he's got beautiful language, and I think it'll be helpful to hear it in the original. So here he's telling a story about whether pursuing wealth is going to make you happy and the things you need to consider in that. He says the following: the poor man's son, whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition, when he begins to look around him, admires the condition of the rich. He devotes himself forever to the pursuit of wealth and greatness. To obtain the conveniencies which these afford, he submits in the first year, nay, in the first month of his application, to more fatigue of body and more uneasiness of mind than he could have suffered through the whole of his life from the want of them, of this wealth and greatness. It says that he begins, so as he pursues his wealth, he will find the wealth to be in no respect preferable to that humble security and contentment which he had abandoned in the pursuit of wealth. And he begins at last to find that wealth and greatness are mere trinkets of frivolous utility, no more adapted for procuring ease of body or tranquility of mind than the trinkets of the lover of toys, and like them too, more troublesome to the person who carries them about with him than all the advantages they can afford him. And then he concludes later on, he says, power and riches appear then to be what they are, enormous and operose machines, contrived to produce a few trifling conveniencies to the body, consisting of springs the most nice and delicate, which must be kept in order with the most anxious attention, and which, in spite of all our care, are ready every moment to burst into pieces and to crush in their ruins their unfortunate possessor. They are, again, they being power and riches, are immense fabrics, which it requires the labor of a life to raise, which threaten every moment to overwhelm the person that dwells in them, and which, while they stand, though they may save him from some smaller inconveniencies, can protect him from none of the severe inclemencies of the season. They keep off the summer shower, not the winter storm, but leave him always as much and sometimes more exposed to anxiety, to fear, and to sorrow, to diseases, to danger, and to death. All right, so this story, you're probably catching on to it, is that the poor man's son sees the wealthy, and he envies them. He says their life is easy, they have great houses, they have servants, they have carriages. That looks wonderful, I want that. And he goes out and decides to work really hard, and he's just ambitious trying to get that. And in his pursuit and his desire for these nice things, he's no longer tranquil, he's no longer content. And in his pursuit of them, he discovers over time, hey, wealth and greatness aren't all that they were chalked up to be. They weren't what he imagined. And he spends all this labor, all this time pursuing them, and yet not finding what he was seeking. All right? As I said before, this bears on the social justice questions of our time. All right? Consider again, here's another piece. Another reason I highlight this story is some of you may know one of the most famous illustrations that Adam Smith is known for is this image or this metaphor of an invisible hand. He says that the amazing thing about markets, about people being able to trade with each other freely and to pursue their own plans and to try to better their condition and improve their lives and the lives of their family, is that in markets there's this beautiful coordination that happens where we exchange, where we work for each other, we trade with each other through prices. Smith only uses this illustration, the invisible hand, he only mentions it 3 times in all of his works, once in The Wealth of Nations, once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then once in an earlier essay about astronomy. The theory of moral, or the invisible hand reference in the Theory of Moral Sentiments comes a page after what I was just reading you, and it's from the following. He says, the rich only select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the sole end which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. All right, so there's some older archaic language there, but this is the heart of why Smith was pro-free markets, right? So you see, he's not pro-capitalist in terms of we should all try to get as much wealth as possible and, you know, the person with the most toys at the end of life wins. He's not saying that. But rather, he sees in the market process that even the most greedy or even the wealthiest folks are led to act in ways and to spend their money in ways that benefit everyone else. Okay, we can talk about that more during the Q&A if you have questions about what does that actually look like. But that's what the market system, in its purest form, represents and is about. All right, so to transition here, you might think, going back to how Smith thinks about happiness, all right, virtue plus consumption. If virtue is so important to happiness, should we require people to be virtuous? Or at least should we pass laws encouraging virtue? All right, and many sort of conservatives, many of my colleagues would say, yes, we should do that because virtue is important and good. But I think Smith would have hesitated to go that route. I think he would have hesitated for a number of reasons, but the main reason has to do with how Smith thought about virtue. And what he says, and again, in the theory of moral sense, he develops this more fully, but what he says is that when we think about what is virtuous, the rules of virtue are like the rules of what is elegant in composition when you're trying to write a beautiful piece. Okay, there are no clear-cut rules about how to write a beautiful, elegant piece. There are rules of grammar, right? You can misspell things, you can misplace commas, but in terms of a rule, follow these rules and you will write something beautiful, there are no clear-cut rules. There are loose rules of thumb. And Smith says that for virtue, we have these loose rules. He says they're loose, vague, and indeterminate. So for example, is someone being courageous or are they being foolhardy? All right, are they being generous or are they being a spendthrift? Okay, when we think about whether someone is acting virtuously, answering that question is going to depend on the circumstances of time and place. It's going to depend on the people involved. It's going to depend on the intentions of the person making the action. And so virtues have these loose, vague, and indeterminate rules that government can't enforce very well because the rule's different. It's different for different people and different contexts. Very difficult to enforce. Except for one virtue. All right? Smith pulls out one virtue in particular, and that virtue is justice. All right? He says that justice are like the rules of grammar. They're precise and they're clear with very few exceptions, and so government can enforce justice. All right, that's something it can do well, and it should do well. I don't have time to read the quote, but Smith talks about, we can think about, do we want people to be beneficent, to be generous, or do we want them to be just in society? And he says justice is more important. Benevolence is nice, but justice is essential for society to function. And so government should promote justice, right, and not try to force benevolence. Again, there's more that can be said there, but I want to keep moving on here. One more thing I'll say about justice, and Chris Martin will probably get into this a little bit as well, is that there are different kinds of justice. So I mentioned earlier social justice. I'm sure many of you hear about social justice, maybe on your Facebook feeds or in the news, and that social justice is looking at income and wealth inequality. But this social justice is concerned with wealth and income inequality. It's one small sliver of what it means of justice in general and what it means to be just, to act justly. And Smith actually has different types of justice that are helpful for thinking about these issues. The type of justice I was just referring to that the government can enforce is what he calls commutative justice. All right? And commutative justice basically means not messing with other people's stuff, not taking what doesn't belong to you, not harming others, fulfilling your contracts, fulfilling your promises. All right, that level of justice, whether you've done that or not, is very clear. Did you take it? Did you not take it? Did you follow your contract? Did you follow your promise? Did you not follow it? Very clear cut. And that's what government should enforce. But there are other types of justice that we can care about. For example, there's something called distributive justice, right, which kind of fits the social justice picture a little bit. But the way Smith talks about distributive justice, the distribution of things, is he says distributive justice is based at the individual level. Distributive justice is making a becoming use of what is one's own. All right, that you can act justly with what you have or unjustly with what you have. You can make a good use of your time, your energy, your resources, or bad uses. But again, that's going to look more like the other virtues, loose, vague, and indeterminate, and how we judge that, how we enforce that. All right, so we've got this. We've got the virtues. We've got justice. We've got happiness being consumption plus virtue. And what I want to leave you with here, and turn the floor over to Chris in a second, is thinking about not just happiness and consumption, but also thinking about justice and how that relates to the free market, the free exchange of goods, the free hiring of labor. is to think about what implications does this have for public policy. Hopefully we'll get into it in the Q&A, and I've written about it. If you look at Smith, you can find implications for, should we have free health care? What would Smith think about the taxation that we have in this country, how we set up the tax structure? What would he think about the various regulations we have, or the education policy that we have? Smith talks about many of these things and hints at them, and if you look at it through the framework of justice, that you find a very compelling view. But what Chris is going to come up now, and I'll let him speak for himself, but what he's going to come and do is he's going to build on what I've just been talking about, and in particular look at specifically how Smith thinks about the poor and about workers and how those transactions work. So with that, I'm finished, and we'll turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I see I've made a profound mistake in going second because Paul has set me a high bar. So thank you to Dr. Moots and Dr. Matchek for inviting us out here today. How many of you, just a show of hands, have taken economics? I understand, sir. So most of you know the term opportunity cost, right? Dr. Moots didn't use it to his credit, but your opportunity cost of sitting here is high because it's such a beautiful day. So thank you guys for being here. In recompense, I want you guys to stand up and stretch for 15 seconds before I begin to inflict my talk on you. Please stand up and stretch. Get your wiggles out. All right, good enough. A little stretching goes a long way. One thing I've learned, ladies and gentlemen, in being a professor and a student is the human frame is not meant to sit for long periods when it's a sunny day outside. So again, thank you for being here. So my task for you today, what I want to try to convince you of, is that Adam Smith is to some extent cursed because he is so obviously right, okay? Adam Smith is cursed because he's so obviously right about a lot of things. Okay, so let me see if I can convince the computer to cooperate here. Adam Smith and the curse of being obvious. Let me give you an analogy from the history of science about the only thing about that I know. So Copernicus, right, back in the late Middle Ages, Copernicus, what did he argue for? He argued for the sun being the center of the solar system rather than the earth. Okay, and you read this in your your history of science textbook or your science text, and you're like, duh, Copernicus, of course. And it's great that he accomplished this, but you don't really give him much credit because, of course, the sun is at the center of the solar system. The only reason that you don't admire Copernicus for this is because he won so completely that the opposition is gone. You don't run into your friend and he's like, I really think the Earth is the center of the solar system. I mean, if you do, you should convince that person. You should really work on that guy. But you don't meet the flat earthers anymore, okay, or the Terracentric advocates anymore, because Copernicus and his helpers won so completely. And what I want to try to convince you of, guys, is that Smith has had, and his helpers and his allies and ideological fellow travelers, had a similar victory with respect to the attitude that society ought to take towards workers and the poor. Right? That probably sounds a little bit surprising because most people, and perhaps you folks are different because you're at this good institution, you're learning some good economics, learning some good history. When they think about Adam Smith, and be honest here, close your eyes and think about Adam Smith, you think of him, he's a little bit unappealing of a figure. Okay, he's kind of like a Reagan Republican. Okay, he has a suit on, he talks about cutting taxes and free enterprise. He's not like this warm, cuddly figure. You don't think of him as being on the barricades with like the working class, right? And to be fair, he's really not. He's in his study writing things, but they have a positive impact on society's view of the poor. Okay, so let me give you the quote, the passage from The Wealth of Nations. It's like the centerpiece of the talk. This is like a little case study. Dr. Mueller's given us a big picture. I want to go narrow in this one particular little quote. This boring quote, all right? It's up on the PowerPoint slide. You guys can read it. Take a couple seconds to do so. right, give me thumbs up if you finished. Okay, 10 more seconds for the rest of you. All right, so if you've read this thing, you probably are having a Copernicus moment. You're probably looking at it, it's like, oh my God, that's like one sentence. It's 18th century, guys, that's how they write. But it's beautiful, okay? You can kind of get into it. It's an acquired taste. But what's the content of what he's saying? He's talking in this chapter, the 8th chapter of The Wealth of Nations, he's talking about how the standard of living of the working people has risen in the 18th century, in his time. Potatoes are cheaper, he says. Grain is cheaper. You can get better clothing now. You can get better household implements. The only thing that's gotten more expensive, he said, is liquor. And that's good because of the things that Dr. Mueller was saying, because it dissipates you, right? And it's gotten more expensive because of taxes. But all the things that matter have gotten cheaper, so real wages have risen. All right, big deal, right? And then he asks this question that seems to have an obvious answer. He says, is this improvement in the circumstances of the lower ranks of the people to be regarded as an advantage or as an inconveniency to the society? Basically, is this a good thing? And you're like, come on, Adam Smith. But there's a reason he has to ask this question, okay? And it has to do with his equivalent of the Terra-centric paradigm that he's working with, okay? He's encountering a strand of the history of economic thinking that might answer no to this question in the first sentence of the excerpt, all right? And so what I'm going to do in the remainder of my little time with you here is we're going to go on an excursion in British history, the history of economic thought. We're going to go back to the Middle Ages and then come back to Smith's time and rebuild the context for this quote so that suddenly it's going to make sense. Because right now it doesn't make sense. It seems like it has an obvious answer. All right? And once you have the context, you're going to realize that Smith is actually a bit more friendly to workers than maybe you might first believe. Okay. All right. Here's a fantastically executed painting of a horrible thing. So we're in the 14th century here. As many of you know, you've taken your Western Civ classes or read some history. We have the bubonic plague is sweeping through Europe in the 14th century. It is on and off through human history, struck in the first millennium, devastated Byzantium and China. It hits Europe several times up until even the 17th century. There's an outbreak of plague in London. But this outbreak in the 14th century is particularly bad. A third of the population of Europe is wiped out in a couple years by the plague. Think about that. One of out of every three of you, gone. Okay? Now, econ folks out there, what happens to the factor price of labor if you take away a third of the supply? Okay? Supply and demand, your mind. Do the cross. Okay? I see people doing the universal sign. Wages are going to increase, right? The exact amount depends on the own wage elasticity of demand, but in fact, the estimate I've seen is that real wages doubled as a result of the Black Death. So it was horrible, okay, it was a terrible thing to have this catastrophe, but if you live, you get a pay increase, all right, because the marginal productivity of labor increases, land is fixed. Now, farming is kind of the whole deal in England at this time, all right? That was the cutting-edge industry, probably about the only industry in England at this time. And so if the majority of wealthy people, they were the aristocrats, okay, the barons, the knights, the lords of the manor, they were employers of labor. So they were trying to hire agricultural workers to till their fields and to bring in the harvest. Serfdom is sort of on its way out. There's beginning to be a labor market with an actual pay rate that's agreed. So when you have real wages begin to push upward, the equilibrium wage begins to rise, this is a problem for the rich and the powerful in England at this time. Right? You guys see how that could be. It's going to cut into their profits, right? Now, fortunately for them, England in the 14th century is not a democracy. It's kind of close to the polar opposite. It's a monarchy with some little bit of representation starting to happen for the upper middle classes and the aristocracy. And so the powerful aristocrats essentially get together in the aftermath of the Black Death, and they pass a law called the Statute of Labourers. The Statute of Labourers, not the Statute of Labourers, the Statute of Labourers. Because, they say in the prologue to the law, servants have no regard to custom, but to their ease and singular covetousness do withdraw themselves from serving great men unless they have livery and wages to the double or treble of that which they were wont to take, to the great damage of the great men and the impoverishing of the commonalty. So in medieval speak, they're saying people are asking for raises. We can't let this go on. And so they establish not a minimum wage, ladies and gentlemen, but a maximum wage. This is labor legislation in the Middle Ages, right? A maximum wage. And the Elizabethans doubled down on this policy. They had it going for a couple centuries. It's sort of working. They tightened it up. They passed this thing called the Statute of Artificers. This is a fun name, artificers. It means workmen, okay? Artificers. Common people. And the goal of the Statute of Artificers is not only to allow maximum wages to be set, except they change it so that now local officials can set the wage. So justices of the peace, who are kind of these county volunteer government magistrates, the justices of the peace can now set the maximum wage. And an additional provision, it compels work in the following way. Let's say you're walking along a road in Elizabethan England and you have an income of less than 40 shillings or your wealth is less than 10 pounds. Okay, 10 pounds was real money in those days. Okay, now it can buy you like a sandwich in London. But if you're poor, essentially, and you're walking down the road and you meet an employer, so you meet Professor Matchek, who's a local landlord, and he says, hey, I've got a job for you, you have to take it if you're unemployed, if you don't have a job already. Because we can't have the poor just wandering around. They'll become vagabonds, okay? You have to take it. And not only that, you can't stay in his employment for anything less than a year. So what's that going to do to your bargaining power, to your ability to search and find high wages? Okay? It's going to inhibit it. It's going to inhibit it severely. Now, don't think the Elizabethans were total ogres. In addition to this legislation that was repressing workers' wages to some extent, they also introduced a primitive or an early welfare system, the Old Poor Law it was called. This was a way you could bring relief to people who were disabled or elderly or simply unemployed. It was a system by which the local parish church would organize a tax called the poor rate on the local area. So, Midland would be a parish and there'd be the parish church. And you would have these folks called the overseers of the poor tax all the wealthy people in the area and use the money to pay, to give cash relief to folks who are unemployed. Okay? Primitive welfare system. So this Statute of Artificers had two facets to it. It had the facet of a degree of repression and control, but also a degree of relief and security. So it was like a deal, right? Except you don't ask the poor whether they want the deal or not. You just have to take it. Now, those of you who are thinking in terms of incentives, as you should be as economists, maybe already see there could be a flaw in this welfare program, this primitive welfare program. Namely, that if it's locality-based, the more poor people you have in your parish, in your local area, the greater your potential tax burden. So give me a thumb check, thumbs down, thumbs up. What's going to be your attitude if some poor people want to move into your locality? No way, right? In fact, this gets codified in the 17th century in something called the Law of Settlement and Renewal. Because it's understood that if poor people are moving around, then the tax burden on these ratepayers, on these sort of successful farmers and shopkeepers and things, is very unstable, okay? You can have an unpredictable tax burden because it's a locality-based system. So instead, what the British legislate is a deal by which, again, if you're poor, if you have below a certain level of wealth or below a certain level of income, you cannot legally enter a parish that is not your own without a signed permission slip from your home parish. It was called a certificate. Okay, so if you wanted to move to the county next to here, and I'm sorry, I'm not from this part of the glove, so I don't know where it is. If you want to leave Midland County and go next door, you have to go to the local poobah, the local justice of the peace, overseer of the poor here in Midland, and say, would you please let me leave? Give me a certificate that says, okay, I belong to Midland. If I go and I get disabled in this adjacent county, you guys don't have to give me a welfare payment. right? That was the reason these certificates existed, is prevent the tax burden from shifting. Put on your evil hat, ladies and gentlemen. If you're a justice of the peace or an overseer of the poor, you're likely to be wealthy and have wealthy friends. And wealthy people need to employ workers to do stuff for them, right? On their farms or in their factories. So do you want to let workers leave the parish? No. No. The certificate became a tool of social control, of fixing workers in place for the benefit of the employers. Hardcore, right? Pre-modern labor legislation. It gets better, ladies and gentlemen. It gets better. Not only was there a lot in practice going on in England before Smith's time that was inimical to the interest of workers, there was a whole theory about why we had to do things this way. And this was called the doctrine of the utility of poverty. Okay, they didn't, no one wrote a book with this title, right? This is what retrospectively historians can see going on, the strand of thinking in pamphlets, in newspapers, in the talk that merchants had with each other. Doctrine of the utility of poverty. And we're going to have a little audience participation here, actually. Check out these quotes. We got, well, they're out of order, top to bottom. Petty, Manley, Mandeville, Arthur Young. I'm going to be transgressive here. Out of the podium here. On this side of the classroom, you guys are the left wing, right? You guys are the right wing. Left wing, I want you to read with me the second to lowest quote, Bernard de Mandeville. Okay, we're going to read together in unison. Is ready? Go. To make the society happy and people easy under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them, let me down here, be ignorant as well as poor. Hardcore. Okay, it's right wing over here. The bottom one, Arthur Young. Everyone but an idiot knows the lower classes must be kept poor, or they will never be industrious. Okay, it's important sometimes to hear things said instead of just reading them to make them come to life, right? This is nuts. It seems nuts to us, but to them it was the mainstream. Let's unpack what's going on here. The doctrine of the utility of poverty had a couple key features. First of all, it viewed that workers were really important. Okay, it's ironic in the light of what I'm about to say, but workers were very important in the economic thought before Adam Smith. They were the source of wealth. They were the source of exports. Those of you who have heard the term mercantilism before know that in the pre-Smithian times there was a very influential body of thought that believed that it was very important to have a trade surplus, okay, meaning you need to export more goods, or more specifically a larger value of goods and services than you imported. And the reasons for this were complicated. Sometimes it just had to do with gold, and we won't get into that. So there was a view that you had to have trade surpluses. So you needed a bunch of workers working hard. There was an argument about the incentives that workers had to work hard, and an argument about the influence wages had on exports. These arguments came together to motivate the quotes that we just read, in which it was claimed that you needed to keep people poor. So let's unpack that real quick. First, the necessity theory of motivation. It was believed that the lower classes, if they got any extra money, would spend it all at the ale house drinking. Okay? So uncharitable people would say that, college students, no, there was worse than that. They were drinking gin, wine, beer, and they would not come to work, okay, if they got any extra money. Now, this actually may have been true, but the reason was not that the English workers were uniquely, dissipated. It was because of the Poor Law. Remember, this was a local-based welfare system. One of the conditions of the Poor Law was that to receive any relief, you had to have no assets. In other words, you were not the residual claimant of your savings. And if you're a person at the lower rungs of society, if you think there's a good chance you're going to hit bottom and need some welfare relief, then there's no incentive to save. You might as well drink. All right? The behavior, in other words, is not because of the character of the workers, but because of the incentive matrix in which they're embedded. It's a deep lesson from the modern world, too. People don't differ, their incentives differ in general. Okay? Maybe limits to that. Necessity theory. Second element, wages cost theory of price. Remember, we need to have exports to exceed imports. How do you get exports? Well, you have to have cheap goods. Well, wages are a part of the cost of goods, right? A big component, maybe even the major component. So a way we can be competitive then, people reasoned, would be to keep wages low. There's something to that, but they forget about productivity, right? They forget about the output per nominal unit of wages, okay? Wages cost theory of price. Embedded in all this, ladies and gentlemen, was an idea that the lower classes were somehow instrumental for the rest of society. That they didn't really, in some sense, that their wealth at least didn't count. That only the wealth of the middle classes, the upper classes counted. You may think I'm being extreme. Read this middle quote, or I'll read it aloud this time. The people of the meanest rank know too much to be serviceable to us. What madness is it to encourage them in this by industriously increasing at our cost that knowledge that they will be sure to make us pay for over again. Mandeville, like the mustache-twirling villain of the 18th century. He's literally provocative. He's arguing against education, ladies and gentlemen. He's saying don't educate the poor or they'll increase their wage demands. Heavens. Okay, so they really believe this stuff. We don't think about the interests of the workers in all this. Okay, so I'll leave those other quotes for some other time. All right, now again, we're talking about how there's a lot of legislation that was in place that could kind of instantiate the doctrine of the utility of poverty. Here is an example of this from the 1780s after Smith wrote a notice published about maximum wages in Kent, which is right outside of London, the maximum that could be allowed, not the minimum wage. There you go. It's a list. Okay, it's a price ceiling on labor, and so you have the head plowman, the mate, and the best woman. Okay, I would be very angry if I was the second sort of woman. I would protest. Come on, people. So it's misogynistic as well as being an interference in the labor market. All right. So now you guys have seen in this little excursion into the Middle Ages and coming forward this weird to us underworld of economic thinking. This is the context I want to contend for Adam Smith's statements about workers. Okay, and I should say, not just Smith. All right, Adam Smith is great. He synthesized a lot of stuff. He has some original elements, but he's not alone. Okay, there's a lot of people who are beginning to fight back against these ideas, also against mercantilism. So here we have Bishop Berkeley, David Hume, Richard Wallace. Okay, so they're all arguing against, in their own way, the doctrine of the utility of poverty. But let's look at this quote again. I've highlighted now some portions that I think are particularly salient. First, look at the black highlighted text. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. 20 minutes ago, you probably thought that was a truism. Now, in light of the doctrine of the utility of poverty, you can see that that actually has content. He's saying, how can it be that we promote prosperity by keeping people poor? Doesn't make any sense. Utilitarianism here, right? You have to add everybody up. Economics is very egalitarian. You need to give it some credit for that. Benefit for me counts as much for the benefit for you. The benefit for a poor man counts as much as a benefit for a rich man. Red highlighted text. It is but equity besides that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well-fed, clothed, and lodged. Okay, equity, ladies and gentlemen, had a meaning in the law. Okay, it was an alternative form of law to common law, and it also meant justice. It meant natural justice. And in Smith, he'll often say natural liberty and justice in the same breath. Okay, maybe you're not convinced that Smith is talking about the doctrine of the utility of poverty. Here's a very abbreviated argument to maybe change your mind. In the paper on which this talk is based, I discuss at length the appearances in the 18th and 17th century of the particular phrase, well-fed, clothed, and lodged, that Smith has in his quote. And I looked for it in the various search engines that are available to us now on the internet and various library archives. And I found that there was a parallel between Smith's phrasing, okay, Smith's here at the bottom, and this guy, Bishop Berkeley, very famous philosopher. Berkeley writes about the utility of poverty. He attacks it in 1760. We know Smith has a copy of this book in his library. Okay, we can see the catalog. And what do you know? Berkeley has that phrase, well-fed, clothed, and lodged, in his book, The Querist. And it does not appear in the same form in any other searchable digital text that I can access, except for one obscure pamphlet about American colonization that comes too late to be relevant. Okay, and I can tell people about that later if you're interested. All right? Mandeville uses the phrase flourishing and happy, okay, in the top quote, the great art to make a nation happy and flourishing. Again, this occurs, as you see in the bottom, in Adam Smith's quote. So my supposition is, and I can't completely prove this, right? It's not completely solid. But the pretty good supposition is that Smith is directly responding and continuing the conversation with both of these men. We know he's aware of them both. They're major public intellectuals. It's a pretty safe supposition. So Smith is answering the doctrine of the utility of poverty. He's an opponent of Mandeville and a friend of Berkeley. Pretty cool. And so where does this end up? This ends up with Smith uplifting natural liberty and justice as the ally of the worker. Okay, here's what he says about attempts to restrict liberty of contract. Okay, who gets to work and make certain products? Who gets to be, for example, a cooper, a person who makes barrels? Who gets to be a blacksmith? He says the property which every man has in his own labor is the most sacred and inviolable. The patrimony of the poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his hands, and to hinder him from employing this strength and dexterity in what manner he thinks proper, without injury to his neighbor, is a plain violation of this most sacred property. You should never start a Smithian sentence without taking an extra breath. Okay, I ran out of breath there. What he's saying is, like, liberty for workers. We usually think of economic liberty just in the context of business, but he's raising it up as the ally of workers. All right? Now, just to close here, Smith was not actually the most brave guy in some respects. He is a little bit tentative at times in the conclusions he draws. He actually never explicitly denounces the Statute of Artificers, which is what I told you was the main legal framework that supported all this utility of poverty business. It ends up being repealed in 1813 after Smith is dead. Smith doesn't directly attack it. Long story short, I think the reason is that Smith was a little bit afraid. There were things going on, there were applications of this legal doctrine that were going on, supported by members of the Parliament who were alive and active in Smith's time. He had a desire, I think, to influence them, to be a kind of a big wheel in policy circles to the extent that that existed in England at that time. And I think that he might have felt that if he outright denounced the utility of poverty, that he would have lost some credibility. So instead, he undermined it subtly. Okay? He wouldn't say, this is totally wrong. He would say, this seems like it's unfair, or it seems like it's in the interest of the employers and not of the workers. Okay? He criticized it by indirection. And elsewhere, where it was safer to be full-throated, then he busts out with this natural liberty and justice language. So if we can fault Smith here, I think it's for not having quite the courage of his convictions. But after Smith, people took up this banner and they launched an assault both on the utility of poverty and on laws outlawing what were called combinations or unions at the time. And there was a period in the early 19th century in which, if you asked, who's on the side of the workers? Who's working for their interest? It would have been the economists. All right? So for whatever our policy disagreements today between left and right in this country, we're both of us branches of Smith in this respect. We're Smith's intellectual children. We all of us agree that the welfare of workers and of the poor counts in the social order, maybe even more proportionally than other people, and the only disagreement is on how best to promote it. So I hope I've convinced you that Adam Smith is actually not such a bad guy and that he actually did have a heart for the workers, even if he was a guy who wrote long-winded sentences. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, I hope that you are thinking of questions you'd like to ask one or both of our panelists. And I would like to start with a question for you, Paul. First of all, 31 years is a long time to work on a single book. So he must have felt there were some either wrong ideas or some undeveloped ideas in the early editions. Why did he work on it so long? And if you could summarize for us, this project. What was the project that he undertook with this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the major changes that he made, and this was in the last edition, is he added a big section at the end of the book that was kind of framing his ideas relative to other philosophers. So he talks about, this is what Aristotle has said, and what Plato said, and what the schoolmen said, and what this, and so he goes through, and he I didn't actually get into this, but he is basically, I think, as he moves on and he's thinking about these things more, I think he's trying to place himself relative to other famous moral philosophers and trying to draw distinctions and parallels, saying, here's all this stuff that's come before, here's where I agree, but here's where I disagree, here's like my particular contribution. And so what really comes out at the last point, he spends a lot of time talking about the Stoics. And Smith kind of dances a fine line here. And when he's thinking about happiness, consumption, and virtue, he's drawing this fine line between sort of the materialists like Bernard Mandeville, who just said, just consume as much as you can, that's what utility is, that's what happiness is, sort of just consume as much as possible. And then on the other side, you've got the Stoics, who said it doesn't matter how much you consume, right? What you consume is, what matters is the mind and your sort of inner sense. And Smith talks about that, and he's trying to balance between the two. He's saying it's not simply just consume as much as possible, but also like consumption matters. It's not just, okay, internal self-control, be happy with nothing. But anyway, so that's one way. One thing I would add, where he has that long section at the end, towards the end of his life, where I think he's thought about it and where he fits. So that's one. Chris, can you think of other things he's added in? He pulls out...
Did The Wealth of Nations have any influence on his thinking compared to the earlier editions? Or?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure. I'd have to go. I haven't studied in detail the things that were pulled out and the things that were added, because the most complete edition is the sixth one, and so that's what we look at. There's actually a really interesting passage on the atonement that he takes out. That's in an earlier edition, where he talks about justice and about our obligations towards others if we harm others, and their obligation to forgive us or not forgive us, and sort of he says, well, relative to God, if you offend God, since he's infinite, that's an infinite offense, and there's sort of this absolute. So it's actually a really interesting passage on sort of the idea of atonement that he pulls out in like the third edition, fourth edition, and that's more sort of where he's going and sort of his beliefs, but that's another major change I'm aware of.
Paul is probably a bit more up in the TNS than I am, but I believe, tell me if this rings a bell, that the mana system is actually added in the 1780s because of the French Revolution.
Could you explain what you
Yes.
mean?
So there's a very famous passage where Smith talks about a type of character, a type of political personality that views society like a chessboard, and that individual people have no impetus of motion besides the hand of the chess player. Okay, so what he means is a kind of a social planner, an architect, right, who's going to organize society. And by contrast, he kind of draws this idea that there's people who understand that there's independent initiative in society, that there's different classes and groups of people, different organizations, all with their own interests, and that this respectful kind of political personality is going to be gentle with society. He's not going to just tear it open and tear it apart. He's going to respect it, even if it's not perfect according to some ideal political scheme. Okay, and his clear target here, I think, is the French Revolution. Okay, because of course there you have idealism that kind of runs amok and it tears a society apart. Again, I may be a bit wrong in the timing, so perhaps Paul can help us.
I think you're right. The editor suggests that he adds that. And that's, I mean, it's a whole other conversation to have. But I think you were talking about just earlier today about the difference between sort of the British or the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. Their views of freedom and liberty and of science are very different. I mean, Smith and the Scots are very skeptical of the rationalism of the French.
Okay, so it seems like with this theory of the utility of poverty, idleness is the great thing that the middle and the upper classes fear. And, they're not worried about the idle rich, but the idle poor. That would really bring down the country. Is there anything different about the way we think about the idle poor today, or do you see any parallels between some of the rhetoric that goes on today and some of the rhetoric that existed back in those days about the idle poor?
I think because we're living in a world that has been deeply influenced by economics, okay, and as well as ideals of equality, that we view our fellow citizens differently than the aristocratic, hypothetical Mandevillean type person would view fellow subjects in Britain in the 1700s. Although we recognize that people can make bad choices and we might wish them to make other choices, we still view them as equals in the sense that their welfare counts as much as ours. And when I say welfare, I don't mean welfare like a welfare payment, I mean well-being. Okay? Their utility, their self-actualization. And so I think that there would be no higher goal. I think people from all parties in any industrial democracy today, if you said, we have a means by which we can raise everyone from poverty, that would be absolutely agreed on, right? The disagreement would be in the details, but the goal would be agreed on. I think if you said that to someone in 1700, they would say, who will do the work? And just to let you know how dangerous this idea is, it is connected to the arguments that the Southern defenders of slavery used before the Civil War. Okay, I think, I'm not as good on this period, but I think it's the mudsill argument. Okay, you always have to have somebody down at the bottom to do the dirty work. And so you need to have some people that are subjected, either enslaved Africans, or in the North, as the Southern defenders of slavery would say, the wage slaves in the factories. Okay? They don't envision a world in which everybody can get rich. So that's the real world. That's the world we're living in. Okay?
Okay, one more question. You mentioned Mandeville, I think both of you did. And if there's anybody that the accusation fits about making a virtue out of selfishness, it's Mandeville, right? So a lot of people, Shannon, Gordon, Gekko, they think, Adam Smith is the source of this idea that greed is good. But would Adam Smith have approved of Gordon Gekko's philosophy, or this idea that somehow greed is a thing that's necessary to make capitalism work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say not at all. I mean, that's right. Mandeville, what Bernard Mandeville comes along and does is he frames the issue and says, maybe there's no important distinction between virtue and vice. If we think about how economies work, well, it's because people like having stuff, right? They like having nice cars, like having nice clothes, they like nice things, and that's a lot of sort of vanity. It's certainly, they don't need nice cars in order to live. And so Mandeville sets up this picture where anything that you have or consume above basic subsistence is vain, it's conceited, it's vicious, or it's full of vice. And so he says, if that's the case, everyone has vice, and that's all right, because that's what makes the economy work. And he actually argues for the point. It's interesting, but we have to talk more about this, because one thing that I think Mandeville does is he accuses the rich of being vicious as well as the poor, because the rich often say the poor have all these vices and dissolute and so forth, but Mandeville says, no, you all are vicious as well in terms of vain and trying to flatter yourselves and so on. But anyway, his project is to basically flatten any distinction between vice and virtue. And Smith and a lot of the other Scots are like horrified at this and say, no, that's totally wrong, right? Virtue is a thing, it does exist. But it can vary over time based on your circumstances. And so Smith says there's a proper way to pursue money, a prudent, controlled way. He has these great passages about how under a free system where you're free with labor and you're free to contract with people, that over time you can slowly accumulate wealth and live in greater ease and security, and how this sort of prudent man with the other virtues is sort of Smith's ideal, that everyone has a chance to live securely, to improve their condition, But there is a virtuous way to do it and not a virtuous way to do it. Now, I think what Smith also would say is that the great thing about markets is that even the non-virtuous people contribute. So the poor man's son, right? The poor man's son who is pursuing wealth in a very imprudent, a very vice-filled way is actually benefiting other people. The parts I didn't read, he's serving people, he's selling them things, he's doing things that they like. Even though he's not being particularly virtuous in doing that, he's helping people. And then the invisible hand passage says the rich, right, even if they only care about themselves, when they spend their money, they're still spending their money and paying all of you to do stuff. Like they're paying you to mow the lawn and to take care of the car and to do this, that, and the other thing. And so even the rich in their activity are helping other people. Another way to think about this, if you look at the wealthiest people in the country, the top two, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, right? Why are they so wealthy? Well, it's all of your fault, right? If any of you have used Facebook or Microsoft before, you are contributing to the problem of income inequality. You may not have realized it, all right? But by using their products, you're giving them money. And so the way they're super wealthy is because millions and millions of people use their products and buy it. So what Smith would say is that virtue is important for personal happiness, but the beauty of a market system is that even if people are just greedy or they just want money or they're just out for that, if they can't get it through political means, that is take it from people, then the only way they can get it is by producing things that people like, and that's a really beneficial thing.
Yeah, I agree with everything Paul just said. Let me just build on that a little bit. There's a very famous passage in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations that you guys who have read any of it probably have heard. When you get it, this is not quite verbatim, but Smith said, it is not from the benevolence from the butcher or the baker or the brewer that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So what he's saying is that in a market system, this thing of interest or self-interest can be channeled to the good of others through voluntary trade, which is kind of what Paul was saying. But you have to have structured around the pursuit of interest a barrier of commutative justice, first of all, to prevent people from stealing their stuff. And also maybe, and maybe Paul and I disagree with this a little bit, you also have questions of character and conduct, even if you're not violating commutative justice. So actually, could I borrow your TMS there for a second? So here's I've got The Wealth of Nations. It's actually 2 volumes, contains a lot of stuff in it. What I would suggest is that for Smith, the TMS and his little proctor is the framework, covers, and is a greater book in some ways than The Wealth of Nations. Because the TMS is about the structures of virtue that ought to guide our conduct. And so here's a real-world example. You guys have heard of this scandal with Wells Fargo that's just happened. Wells was it was pressuring its employees to meet some pretty aggressive sales targets for opening up new accounts from customers. They engaged in almost intimidation behavior towards these young employees who didn't know any better necessarily. And some of the employees essentially committed fraud. So Wells Fargo violated the laws of justice by allowing that to happen, arguably. But I think they also made an error in pushing these young employees too hard to ask an impossible sales goal that they must have known, or they should have known, would tempt them to engage in fraud. And so I guess what I'm saying is Smith believed that self-interest could be turned to good, but it has to be fenced in by both laws and ethics.
Okay, now I'll turn it over to you. Are there questions for our panelists?
Can I actually ask Chris a quick question? Chris, quick question, sorry, just to clarify. When we were talking about the parish system, you said 2 things that I wasn't quite sure how they reconciled. So on the one hand, the parish system had to support the poor, and the more poor people you had, the higher the taxes on the wealthier the people who paid their rate, which suggested that parishes didn't want a lot of poor people there to support it. But on the other hand, they wanted poor people to work for them. And so when you think about the certificate to move parishes, they wouldn't actually let them leave. But it seems like they wanted fewer poor people, they would want to let them leave. So then we could unpack that a little
Okay,
bit.
good question. So what you ideally want, and remember this is evil head on, what you ideally want is a bunch of people who are poor but they're working and not collecting the payment. Okay, so that's the goal. The second thing, and I'm sorry that I was probably unclear about this, the certificate, all it said was, Bob lives in Midland and we're responsible for him. So you don't actually get to get rid of your obligation to Bob. All you do is let him go forth and work.
Oh, I see.
So yeah, in some ways,
It's
it
like
given-
labor leave, but not the obligation.
right. So it was very difficult to establish what was called a legal settlement in another parish. So it was optional. The best strategy for the justice of the peace would have been to keep able workers in their parish, but keep the wage rate low.
Yes, sir.
So you talked about communicative and non-communicative justice.
Could you speak up?
Oh, sorry. You talked about justice that the government can handle, which is communicative justice, and then other times it should just be left. Did you say something about Smith's line of demarcation between these two things? Because we're not just individual rational creatures, but we also live in a community, and the counterintuition to that view seems to be that the government is always going to spill over from some part line of communicative justice.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways to respond to that of how Smith thinks about it. So first, he thinks that commutative justice is the core, but he does make exceptions where he says there are certain cases where government should go beyond that. So education might be an example, public works might be an example. So there are a few exceptions where that you're kind of referring to, where there are things that affect all of us and not just as individuals. So government might be able to make some provisions for those things. But I think he just sees the mechanism being really differently. So with distributive justice, Smith has one thing I love about Smith is he has a very robust system for thinking about morality and right and wrong. So one problem with a lot of libertarians, for example, is they also tend to be libertines in terms of not believing there's such a thing as right and wrong. Like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, you're going to do what you're going to do, we're just not going to harm each other, and that's it. Smith would have been totally skeptical of that. He's like, no, you're behaving badly, right? Now, I might not force you to not behave badly in terms of your personal conduct, but I'm going to condemn you for it, I'm going to argue with you, I'm going to censure you. And so he had a very robust view that, like, within society, we should be having conversations about all kinds of moral issues, not simply harm issues. And I think he saw civil society and social pressure as a means for dealing with a lot of these issues, of interpersonal issues in particular. And he says, you know, it's not the government's job to break up fights in the schoolyard, for example, but like it's the involvement of the students and the parents and sort of this more organic development, not just calling the police in, to deal with that sort of thing. And I think you would say that in all of those cases, it's going to vary a lot by case. Like, what's the proper thing to do in this case or that case is going to be really different. So you can't just have a law that's going to deal with both cases really well. And so in areas where there's a lot of variation of context and circumstance and people involved, it's better to rely on the moral arbitration and interaction between people than trying to get some sort of heavy-handed government rule involved. Now again, there are some exceptions, but the commutative justice says for commutative stuff, you should have government involved promoting that framework. But beyond that, distributive or estimative or others, you should have allowed for more of the social interaction. Do the follow-up.
I mean, my only follow-up would just be to ask, what is the more explicit method by which we
For determining
decide
it?
which something is on which side of the line? Is it utilitarian? Is it about promoting public virtue?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good question. So I think part of it. So commutative justice is defined loosely as not harming other people and their person, property, reputation. Now, maybe you're asking where the exceptions. How do we decide about the exceptions? Is
Yeah,
maybe.
you mentioned education.
Mhm.
Is that just a general utilitarian public good that we need to promote, or is that about virtue?
Yeah, I think it's more public good than virtue. Although he does talk about it. Maybe I don't know if Chris has more to add on this. I think basically what he suggests is a matter of prudence. Like there's not, because it's an exception, there's not a clear rule for it. I mean that's what makes it an exception. And so it's a matter of discussion, judgment of values, and discussion and determining what are the costs, what are the benefits. But his general, he has what sometimes we call a presumption of liberty, that we should presume that people should be free, and then in rare cases there might be some overriding public good. Somebody talks about certain banking rules or party walls between buildings, requiring people to put in walls to prevent the spread of fire. Technically is a violation of liberty, but it might be the public good is so much greater, it's worth doing that. So there's no clear, I mean, this is sort of the matter of discussion and prudence to it. He doesn't have a clear rule like these are the exceptions.
Yeah, again, I'm sort of putting it to Paul here. I want to pick up on the particular theme of overriding the general rule. So there is one instance in the Wealth of Nations where he talks about, he's like coming up with these scenarios, right? He says, well, what if there was a small country that had a good harvest, but it was surrounded by a huge continent that was in famine? Okay, and the question is, do you allow the export of grain in those circumstances? Right? Because if you allow it, then your country starves too, right? And he says that the prince of this country should forbid the exportation of grain. But then he adds a very interesting sentence. He said, even though that is a violation of the natural liberty of the farmer, because ordinarily the farmer should be able to sell the grain to whoever he wants, right? But in this one particular case, the public good is so strong, it doesn't eliminate the natural liberty of the farmer, it just overrides it in a temporary circumstance. Right? And then one more thing to say here. Smith has this very confounding passage in TMS called the superior passage, at least that's what our group of students used to call it, in which he says that between equals to enforce distributive justice is impertinent. So if I said to Dr. Matchak, you should really give your tie to Dr. Mueller, right? That would be extremely impertinent because we're equals, right? You know, we're like citizens. But if a superior of both of us should command some good office, like, you know, King George comes, then it would maybe be okay. But the test for whether it's okay is universal approbation, which means essentially the political community agrees that it's okay to issue a command like that. And his example was like commanding that parents take care of their kids, and kids take care of their parents in old age. So things where it's like, okay, this is our common moral sense. No one is going to feel like particularly coerced by this. It's unanimous.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so I wrote down, you have the necessity theory, which has something to do with just don't incentivize bad behavior. Don't just on the slide where the guys were sitting in the bars drinking because it's more worthwhile than anything else at this time. How would you say that Adam Smith was gone about not incentivizing bad behavior, but actually incentivizing good behavior?
Well, first, this is a great question. Let me just provide a little more context. I don't think that the argument, Doctrine of Utility of Poverty was not saying, let's stop incentivizing bad behavior. It was saying, let's prevent people from earning money because we think they're going to go do bad things. So that's a subtle difference. Like if you were incentivizing it, you'd be like subsidizing the gym. Okay? In this case, the utility poverty guys are like, let's remove from them the means of abusing it. I don't know that Smith, he didn't fully grapple with this argument. Okay, so it was like he disliked the application of it, but I'm not sure that he really in his mind had a solution. Other people later who have kind of thought about this, they analyze the situation to say that the poor laws were the reason that people were behaving badly, the way the poor laws were set up. And so in the 19th century, there's a lot of effort put in by reformers to make it so that it became in the interest of the working class to save. John Stuart Mill would talk all the time about how we need to make it easier legally for people to buy property and become small capitalists and landowners. Okay, so that was their way of saying, let's reward effort and thrift in human nature. You know? So that's kind of what you're saying, incentivizing good behavior.
And I think so. Smith is not totally opposed to it, but I think he would have been skeptical of the need for it to some extent, because he says, you know, in another chapter, he says that each man is principally concerned for his own benefit and welfare. He cares about his own life. He cares about the lives of his family and of his friends, and so there's sort of this natural self-interest, self-preservation argument that if you let people be free, so part of the issue with the poor laws and other things going on is that people were being discouraged from taking care of themselves because they were not able to do that. But if you left them free to do it, then they would choose to provide for themselves and their families. I'm sure you all have parents and relatives who work hard to raise you, to provide opportunities for you. That's sort of a natural human tendency. Smith would say we wouldn't have to encourage that. Part of the reason we talk about encouraging it so much today, right, encouraging people to work, encouraging people to do these things, is because we have so many discouragements with the welfare system or with high labor costs or other sorts of things. And so we're talking about all this encouragement for people to save. Well, it's because of Social Security and other things, we discourage them from saving. And I think Smith would say if you're not discouraging them from saving, they naturally will try to provide for themselves and their family. And that's sort of a natural, the Stoics talk about that, Smith talks about that as a natural human tendency.
Would you two just mind summarizing for us Adam Smith's legacy in terms of his impact on perhaps the 19th century or the development of cultural beliefs about capitalism or the market economy? Was he as important to that development as he seems to be? Does he deserve the credit as being kind of the intellectual apologist par excellence for capitalism?
I think so, at least initially. So Smith was widely read. I mean, his work sold very, very well when he was alive in Britain. He talked with people in Parliament. He knew Edmund Burke reasonably well, and they conversed and were on very friendly terms. And then Smith, again, he had students who went out. Dugald Stewart is one in particular who wrote a biography and then talked about Smith's legacy. But Smith really sparked this whole school of thinking, and Smith and his colleagues, but Smith is sort of the standard bearer with writing the most systematic work on it and being very vocal about it in many, many circumstances. Anyway, they kind of persuaded an elite group of people through the 1800s to work to remove the poor laws, to remove the corn laws, which Chris can tell you more about probably in a second, and to promote more free trade. Free trade is also another huge theme in Smith that economics has picked up and still carries today. And so yeah, he was very influential at the time he lived and time after. And then things got distorted a little bit in the 20th century, but maybe I'll let Chris add on before we get there.
That's a pretty difficult question to answer. I think that Smith probably was more influential in the first half of the 19th century, and even more so, even in perhaps the first quarter of the 19th century, because that's like the high age of classical liberal and policy things. So we're getting rid of these utility poverty laws. We're getting rid of laws against labor unions. We're going to have free labor. We're going to get rid of laws that make grain more expensive. These are the corn laws. The British, because they're insane, call corn for them means grain. Okay, who knows why I say that? But I don't think Smith ever really foresaw the factory system. Just think like Dickens, right? Huge mass production, the rise of a large working class that were wage laborers in these big new industrial cities. He may not have fully foreseen that, and he might not have foreseen some of the social problems that gave rise to. A lot of people, economic historians, fight about this, but there's a credible case that standards of living were improving in Smith's time, but then there was kind of this stagnation and actually maybe a per capita dip lasting until maybe the 1840s. And it was in that period that the socialist and communist opponents of capitalism really got started. And even though standards of living then resumed their upward progress, by then the belief had been created that capitalism was bad and dangerous for workers. And in a way, like the giant fight since then has been about the duel of these different tendencies. So is Adam Smith like guilty for not foreseeing that? No. But he got the ball rolling, and he deserves a lot of credit for that.
What about the Enclosure Acts happen then? Isn't that something that's attributed to the lowering of falling wages?
It's hard to know. This is kind of hard to explain. The British used to have a lot of common property in their villages that would be used for grazing sheep, for example. And it was like a nice buffer. If you lost your job, you could go and like garden on the common or something. Starting really as far back as the 16th century, but culminating in the early 1800s, those common areas were converted to private property, often in a way that was not very beneficial to the poorer villagers. And so Marxist historians have looked at this as a big blow against the working class, which actually it may have been. It's just hard to know how important. But notice, that's not a capitalist thing. That's the use of the political process to seize wealth for the cronies. Okay, so something to always keep in mind, and I'm sure here in Northwood you guys talk about this. Capitalism and crony capitalism are not the same. Under real capitalism, the kind that I think Smith would have endorsed, there's no special privileges just because you're rich and you're powerful. Everybody's equal. Everyone has equal access to access the market, to start a business, to be free.
Well, And that will end tonight's program. Thank you both very much for your enlightening presentation. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you at the next forum event.